Karel had spent his entire life in the company of things that no longer spoke. As a restorer, he was a silent observer of history, a man who found comfort in the cold dust of crypts and the hollow echoes of abandoned cathedrals. But the panopticon of ages was a different kind of silence. It didn't feel empty. It felt occupied. The air in these marble halls was heavy, thick with the scent that shouldn't exist underground, a mixture of fresh lavender, sharp formaldehyde, and the electric tension of a storm that refused to break. Mr. Varga, the owner of this morbid collection, was a man of few words and shadow-filled eyes. On Karel's first night, Varga had laid a heavy silver key on the desk and whispered a warning that now haunted every step Karel took. "Time is only a guest within these walls, Karel. Do not wake it. Let the centuries rest, and they will return the favor." At the time, Karel had smiled, dismissing it as the eccentricity of a wealthy collector. He thought these figures were merely masterpieces of wax and pigment. He was wrong, terribly wrong. 14 nights. That was all it took for the boundary between the living and the frozen to blur. As Karel walked his rounds, the beam of his flashlight felt like a scalpel, cutting through a darkness that seemed to push back. He began to notice things. The way a Roman soldier's eyes seemed to hold the reflection of a light that wasn't there. The way the dust settled on the eyelashes of a Victorian beggar, as if it were being moved by a breath too slow for a human ear to catch. He wasn't just guarding statues. He was guarding a cage filled with the weight of thousands of years. Tonight, the panopticon felt restless. The silence was no longer a void, it was a frequency. A high, thin vibration that hummed in the marrow of his bones, like the tuning of 1,000 ancient radios. Every step he took on the marble floor echoed twice, once for him, and once for the shadows that followed just a second too late. He told himself it was the exhaustion, the isolation, the mind playing tricks in the dark. But then, from the far end of the gallery of crowns, he heard it. The clear, rhythmic sound of a single coin hitting the floor and rolling into a darkness where no one should be standing. Karel froze. The sound of the rolling coin hadn't stopped. It had merely dissolved into a new, more terrifying sound. A soft, wet whisper of fabric against marble. He turned his flashlight toward the Hall of the Forgotten, but the beam felt heavy, as if the darkness had turned into a thick, black syrup. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted. It wasn't just cold. It was an aggressive, predatory frost that clawed at his skin. His breath emerged in thick, white plumes of vapor, swirling in the air like ghostly fingers reaching for his throat. The panopticon was no longer a museum. It had become a tomb that had forgotten how to stay frozen. In the center of the hall stood Elarya. In the daytime, tourists marveled at her 19th century lace and her delicate, melancholic expression. But tonight, in the shivering light of Karel's torch, she looked different. Her skin wasn't just wax. It was translucent, like thin ice over a deep, dark river. As Karel drew closer, his professional eye noticed something that defied every law of restoration he had ever learned. On her pale temple, a tiny blue vein was visible. It wasn't painted. It wasn't carved. It was moving. A rhythmic, agonizingly slow pulse. One beat, then an eternity of silence. Then another. Karel wanted to run. Every instinct yelled at him to drop the keys and never look back. But the restorer in him, the man who spent decades feeling the texture of history, couldn't move. He felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the girl. He began to think about Varga's words. Don't wake the centuries. Was this what he meant? Was Elarya a masterpiece of chemistry, or was she a prisoner of a science that had no name? He looked at her eyes, and for a fleeting second, he thought he saw a flicker of movement behind the glass lenses, a desperate prayer trapped in a cage of synthetic polymer. Then the silence broke. A collective whisper, like the rustling of 1,000 dry leaves, echoed through the hall. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside his head. Help us. With a trembling hand, Karel did the unthinkable. He stripped off his leather glove, exposing his warm skin to the freezing air. He reached out and pressed his fingertips against Elarya's wrist. The shock was instantaneous. It wasn't cold wax. It was soft, yielding flesh, radiating a strange sub-zero heat that burned like dry ice. The pulse he felt wasn't a mechanical tick. It was a heart, beating once every minute, keeping a soul alive in a hell that had no exit. Karel pulled his hand back as if he had touched a live wire, but the connection didn't break. The electric hum in his brain intensified, a chaotic storm of memories that weren't his, the smell of burning coal, the screams of a forgotten battlefield, the taste of salt on a ship that sank centuries ago. He looked at his fingertips and his breath hitched. A faint golden dust stayed on his skin, glowing with a bioluminescent light that traced the lines of his fingerprints like ancient runes. The panopticon had recognized him. He was no longer a witness. He had become part of the circuit. Then came the sound. It started as a faint crackle, like a fireplace dying out, but it grew into a deafening chorus of snapping wood and shattering glass. One by one, the figures in the Hall of the Forgotten began to shudder. The Roman legionnaire's neck turned with the sickening, grinding noise of dry polymer rubbing against bone. A Victorian lady's arm twitched, her silk dress tearing as her stiff waxine joints forced themselves to move. They weren't stepping off their pedestals. They were breaking out of themselves, shedding layers of synthetic skin like snakes in a winter nightmare. Karel backed away, his boots skidding on the frosted marble. He watched in horror as the statue screeches of 1,000 ears stepped down into the aisle. Their movements were grotesque, a staccato dance of bodies that had forgotten the fluid grace of the living. They didn't speak with mouths, but their presence filled the room with a psychic weight that made Karel's nose bleed. They surrounded him, not with malice, but with a terrifying, hollow yearning. Their glass eyes were wide, pleading, reflecting the flickering beam of his flashlight as they reached out with fingers that were half flesh, half sculpture. Suddenly the main breakers groaned and gave up. The last flicker of the emergency lights died, plunging the museum into a darkness so absolute it felt physical. But the silence didn't return. In the void, Karel heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of something far larger. Something coming from the service shaft behind the Gallery of Crowns. It was a metallic, wet sound, the stride of a creature built to hunt in the dark. The warden, Karel whispered to the shadows, remembering the rumors of Varga's personal enforcer. The statues stopped their advance, turning their cracked faces toward the sound of the approaching iron. Even the dead were afraid of what was coming. The freight elevator descended like a sinking coffin, its rusted cables screaming in protest. Karel leaned against the cold metal wall, watching the floor numbers flicker and die. The higher floors belonged to the art, to the beautiful lies Varga sold to the public. But as the elevator bypassed the basement and plunged into the sublevels, the air changed. It became humid, smelling of copper and ancient, stagnant oil. When the doors finally groaned open, Karel didn't find a cellar. He found a factory of nightmares, a sprawling cathedral of brass, pipes and glowing glass tubes that stretched into the sunless depths of the earth. Rows upon rows of massive glass cylinders stood like silent sentinels in the amber gloom. Each was filled with a thick, viscous liquid that shimmered with a pale, bioluminescent light. Inside them, floating like unborn gods, were people. A monk from the Middle Ages, a soldier from the trenches of Verdun, a child in a silk dress from a forgotten dynasty. They weren't dead and they weren't alive. They were suspended in a state of perpetual harvest. Thin, fiber-optic cables were fused directly into their spines, pulsing with a rhythmic blue glow as they drained the only thing Varga truly valued, their experiences. Karel walked past a terminal where a small brass plate was engraved with the words, "Witness 412, the Fall of Constantinople." As he stared at the face of the man inside, a screen flickered to life nearby. It wasn't showing data. It was showing images. Raw, violent memories of fire, the smell of cedarwood burning, the sound of a city weeping. Varga wasn't just preserving these people, he was strip-mining their souls. He was selling the trauma of history to those who had too much money and too little feeling. To Varga, humanity was just a hard drive made of flesh and bone, waiting to be accessed. A shadow elongated across the floor, cutting through the amber light. Exquisite, isn't it, Karel? The voice was calm, cultured, and terrifyingly thin. Pan Varga stepped out from behind a central pillar, his spectacles reflecting the blue pulse of the machines. Behind him, the warden loomed a mountain of iron and leather, its mechanical lenses clicking as they zoomed in on Karel's heart. "Most people look at the past through a keyhole," Varga whispered, stroking a brass valve. I opened the door. "And you, my dear restorer, have just volunteered to be our newest chapter, the witness of the 21st century. A role you were born to play." Varga's smile was as cold as the liquid in the tanks. He moved his hand toward a control panel, his fingers dancing over ivory buttons that controlled the fates of hundreds. The warden stepped forward, the heavy thud of its iron boots cracking the tiles of the laboratory floor. Karel felt the air vibrate with a lethal charge. He looked at the fiber-optic cables, those glowing blue umbilical cords that fed Varga's greed. He realized that this wasn't just a museum, it was a parasite. And he was the only cell in this organism that refused to cooperate. He didn't look for a weapon, he looked for the heart of the lie. With a roar that was part rage and part pure, unfiltered terror, Karel lunged for the main junction. His hands, calloused from years of delicate restoration, grabbed the primary nerve cord of the panopticon. Varga's face twisted in a mask of sudden panic. "No, you'll kill them all," he screamed. But Karel knew better. They were already dead. He was just giving them their funeral. He braced his feet against the vibrating floor and, with every ounce of strength he possessed, he ripped the cable from its housing. A blinding arc of violet electricity erupted, throwing Karel across the room like a rag doll. Then the screaming started, not from mouths, but from the machines themselves. The amber liquid in the tanks began to boil, turning into a frothing golden foam. The data wasn't flowing anymore, it was exploding. Centuries of stolen memories, of love, of war, of agonizing loss were no longer being harvested. They were being released. The central terminal surged, sending a massive feedback loop directly into Varga's remote control. The collector didn't have time to scream. Thousands of lives, thousands of years of human experience poured into his mind in a single microsecond. He collapsed, his eyes turning as white as bone, his brain unable to process the weight of the world he had tried to own. The warden stood paralyzed, its mechanical brain fried by the chaotic interference. Its lenses spun wildly, clicking and whirring as it tried to identify a target in a room where every atom was screaming. Steam hissed from its joints, and with a final agonizing groan of twisting metal, the giant collapsed into a pile of useless iron. Karel watched from the floor as the glass cylinders began to spiderweb. One by one they shattered, flooding the laboratory with amber tears. The symphony of the panopticon was reaching its final chaotic crescendo, and for the first time in centuries, the witnesses were finally becoming more than just data. The fire didn't start with a spark. It started with the friction of centuries rubbing against each other. As the electrical fires consumed Varga's laboratory, the amber liquid began to evaporate, turning into a golden mist that rose through the elevator's shafts like the breath of a waking god. Karel stood in the middle of the chaos, watching a miracle. The figures from the cylinders and the statues from the halls weren't burning. They were dissolving. Without the chemical chains holding their molecules together, their bodies half-waxed, half-flesh, began to crumble into a fine, glowing dust. They weren't dying. They were finally being allowed to age all at once in a beautiful, silent rush toward the end. Through the haze, a figure approached him. It was Elarya, But she was no longer the translucent doll from the Hall of the Forgotten. Her skin was warm, her eyes had depth, and for the first time she wasn't pulsing to the rhythm of a machine. She reached out and touched Karel's cheek. Her hand felt like sunlight on a winter morning. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The gratitude in her eyes was a language older than any history book. She leaned in, whispering the final silent thank you into the air before her form softened, turning into a swirl of starlight that joined the others, drifting upward through the shattered roof toward the night sky. Karel stumbled out of the service entrance just as the first windows of the panopticon shattered from the heat. He stood on the sidewalk, a lonely figure covered in soot and golden dust, watching the building burn. The fire department sirens were loud, but to Karel they sounded like they were 1,000 miles away. He watched the smoke, convinced he could see the silhouettes of Roman soldiers, Victorian maids, and ancient kings dancing in the flames, finally free from their waxing cages. Varga's empire of stolen time was gone. The archives were closed, and the only witness left was a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be afraid of the dark. Karel never touched another relic. He walked away from the world of restoration, finding a small salt-sprayed cottage on the coast, where the only history was the rhythm of the tides. People in the village say the old man is mad, always writing letters to people who don't exist. But Karel isn't writing to the living. He's writing down the stories the voices told him in that one eternal second of the storm. He looks at his hands, still marked by the faint, invisible scars of that night, and smiles. He is the only man on earth who knows that the past doesn't want to be preserved. It wants to be remembered, and then it wants to be forgotten. And as the sun sets over the ocean, Karel finally accepts the greatest gift of all, the beauty of a life that actually ends.